Oh man, it's been a while since I've been here. Alright, I'll try not to talk for too long. I don't really want to anyway. Make sure my audio is still okay. Alright, looks good. Let me know if there's any problems. Alright. Today we're going to talk about lies and omissions, which is going to be one of our shorter sections because discussion on this topic tends to be a little bit uninteresting, in my opinion. But we'll see if you guys can make something fun out of it. Maybe we'll take it to another day or two. But I find most people are pretty unwilling to change their mind on this stuff because it's pretty foundational. Once you've decided what truth is, you're probably not going to change your mind about it. It kind of requires a whole rework of your life's philosophy. So if you have a good conception of what truth is, you probably have a good conception of what kind of responsibility different entities have to tell the truth to each other, don't you? So let's talk about that a little bit. Okay. So first, an interesting thing about the country that we live in and how we value the truth, which is actually very little. And that's by most accounts, well, let's say most, let's say by many people's accounts, at least by the designers of the system that we live in, the freedom to lie was a good thing. It's part of the foundation of the freedom of speech. So does freedom of speech give you the freedom to lie? Well, if you don't have the freedom to lie, then clearly you don't really have freedom of speech. I mean, that's kind of obvious. It's sort of paradoxical if you have the freedom to speak, but only things that are true. So of course, freedom to speak in general gives you the ability to lie. If you don't have the ability to lie, then you can easily suppress something that anybody wants to say by just saying that it isn't true. And many things that are considered to be not true end up becoming true later. So this is very bad for a society that's trying to advance into the future eventually, because things that are true today will probably not be true in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, let alone 200. So a society that's looking to advance definitely needs a freedom to lie. But then it's also very difficult to set up politically because, well, whoever's in charge and has the ability to determine what is true ends up having a significant ability to suppress everybody else, and then everybody else gets angry, and if everybody else gets angry enough to pick up the pitchforks and start throwing fireballs everywhere, then that's not good for anyone. So it's a nice way to promote civil order in some ways. Let's look at some things that you might have said when the country was founded in 1776 or thereabouts. You could have said something like, I have a foolproof test to see if someone is a witch. Just stack rocks on top of them, and if they die, then they must have been a witch. And if they don't die, then they also must have been a witch. It's foolproof. Or something like, disease is caused by miasma. Just don't hang around bad-smelling stuff or fog or whatever. You'll be good to go. Can you prove me wrong? Well, maybe you can, but I doubt any of you could really prove me wrong. You could lead me to evidence that proves me wrong. I could disregard your evidence because, frankly, your evidence requires a pretty substantial leap of faith for somebody who is convinced at this point. You're telling me that there are little germs, but I can't see them all over me. Are you mental? Little microorganisms? What? What's a microorganism? Look at my hand. Do you see anything on this? Lunatic. Right? Lots of things are very difficult to disprove. And so you basically have to have the freedom to lie to be able to say anything that's not easily disprovable. Somebody else had a foolproof witch test to see if they weigh the same as a duck. I have to say that one doesn't work. But if they float like a duck in the water, then they're not a witch. If they sink, then they are a witch. A lot of people know this, the fire in a crowded theater bit. This is an interesting meme because it's kind of been around for a long time in our political discussion. Lots of people say it. It's funny because if you use it as a justification for why you think that people shouldn't generally be allowed to lie, In my opinion, you agree with the fundamental basis for this decision. And the quote actually comes from a 1919 Supreme Court decision where a man went to prison because he was passing out leaflets that opposed the draft. I believe he was a pacifist, or maybe he opposed the draft for some other reason, whatever, conscientious objector or something. But he didn't like the draft. He printed out some flyers, passed them out saying the draft sucks, basically. Put him in prison for that. They put him in prison for that and quoted this. They said the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. What they were saying was him handing out anti-draft pamphlets was equivalent to shouting fire in a theater, because if America couldn't get the bodies to win the war that it was fighting, then something bad would happen, akin to a fire. Very difficult argument to understand in modern times, especially since the war was way over there, not anywhere near America, so it's not like anyone American was going to burn. So, weird metaphor to pull, but anyway, that's where it comes from. So not a great time for our country, actually. And that kind of thinking only lasted about 50 years, actually gradually eroded away, but then was almost completely overturned when the Supreme Court heard another case in 1969, when the Ku Klux Klan here in Ohio had a rally in Hamilton County. That's Cincinnati, but still our state. And in this Ku Klux Klan rally, they said the kinds of things that Ku Klux Klan people tend to say, which is that they're going to take vengeance against all the minorities and yada, yada, yada. So, things that are not very nice, and also things that advocate for things that anybody would reasonably assume are probably violent, but not against anybody specific, just against entire minority groups. And they also advocated for a march on Congress, which should be pretty familiar to everybody. Certainly had a lot of those over the years. And in that Supreme Court case, they updated the terms of what you're allowed to say and made it more explicit. And basically, the rule that governs us today, from 1969 onwards, is that you are allowed to lie as long as you don't cause imminent lawless action. So you could yell fire in a crowded theater. Number one, if there was a fire. Number two, if you believed there was a fire. And maybe even if you didn't believe there was a fire. Although you wouldn't be free from the civil consequence of wasting everybody's money for the movie ticket, you probably wouldn't go to jail. Although I wouldn't encourage you to try it. So let's talk about false advertising, which is the other myth that I think people tend to believe about the United States, is that you have to be honest about how you represent your product and your service, or somebody will come after you. We barely have false advertising laws in America. Other countries have pretty strong ones, but we don't really. For one thing, almost nobody has standing to make a false advertising claim. So a competitor in the industry can bring a claim, and the FTC can bring a claim, but consumers, not really. Unless the violation was egregious and they caused a tremendous amount of damage through their dishonesty, regular customers are not really permitted to argue on these grounds. So the only thing you can do if somebody tells you something that's not true, and then you go out and make a financial decision based on it, you can complain to the FTC about them and hope that the FTC goes and does something about it. And the FTC doesn't do that much about it. First of all, let's look at the requirements for false advertising or not false advertising. Look at the requirements for true advertising. So first, your claim has to be substantiated, but the FTC doesn't really care how you substantiate it. And we're all kind of intuitively aware of this in the United States, that when a commercial on TV says that product A is X% better, X% better than what doesn't really matter. We know that it's meaningless. Product A and product B are both going to say that they're X% better than each other. The only thing that you have to do to be in the clear from this is to have done some kind of test to substantiate your claim. And of course, when you do your own tests to substantiate your claim, it's not particularly hard to get the result that you want. Another thing that's required for advertising is that disclaimers must be clear, but again, we all know from seeing drug commercials and toy commercials and I don't know, any kind of commercial that at the bottom of the screen in size 6 font, the disclaimers run by at a speed that is so fast that I don't think the fastest reader known to mankind could read it. I guess technically you could pause the screen if you had DVR, or I don't know, but I guess clear generally means there was any possibility whatsoever of you reading it, because it certainly doesn't have to be easy to see the disclaimer on U.S. advertisements. You have to show the product in normal use. You can't show it in an extreme case. So everybody's familiar with how those lovely cleaning chemical commercials show things getting cleaned up. Well, you have to show a normal situation. And if you promise refunds or warranty, you have to honor it. Otherwise, you could get false advertising claims against you. Though this one, in practice, is probably the least enforced. All kinds of organizations, as I think everybody knows, will just not bother honoring their warranty. It's pretty darn common. It's also important to note that an omission, if it's important enough, can count as misleading. So if you're selling a drug and it might cause diarrhea and you don't say that, you're going to be on the hook, probably. That's a case where you will be gone after. But omission can mean any number of millions of things. If you're selling a toy and it would kill you if you swallowed it, do you have to say that? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Blanket statements are not very well tolerated. So if you say something like, we collect your data for any reason, the regulators are not going to be too happy with that. And another interesting point is that as a third party, so as a web designer, for example, if you build a web page for a business, you're liable for the information that you put on there. Regulators can go after you, which is a mixed bag, because on one hand, it means that software developers can be liable for the advertising that they facilitate. On the other hand, if you make a web page for some organization, it turns out all their claims are fraudulent, now you can just point the finger at each other. Your fault, no, your fault, no, your fault. And yet, the internet is a very big place, and every year the FTC only wins about $500 million in refunds to consumers. A bit more on that, a bit more than that in fines. But most of the people that they go after are not software companies, and there's obviously way, way, way more commerce going on in America than that. I mean, that is like a percent of a percent of a percent. And even when they do come after somebody, let's look at Snapchat, for example. So the FTC came after Snapchat for misleading people about the disappearing nature of their messages. Of course, the Snapchats don't disappear. You could just take a screenshot. Duh, everybody knows that. And of course, they store the message on their servers. Duh. As well as that, personal data harvesting issues. And they just had crappy security around their data storage. So they had a leak and millions of users' information got leaked, hacked. The punishment that Snapchat got when they settled was no fine, no jail time for anybody. They have to revise their marketing language and submit to a third-party audit for like 10 or 20 years or something. And then that's it. So pay money to have better security, don't sell data, and pay money to not mislead customers about the disappearing nature of messages, or not do any of that and suffer essentially no consequences. Well, I'm going to go with B, if I'm thinking purely from a business perspective. All right, fine then. So what does it mean for something to be true? Let's talk about that before we talk about today's topic. So old school philosophers tended to have kind of a tautological definition of truth. They argued that truth is just copying objective reality. So when you're telling the truth, you're representing reality, and you're doing so usually with your words, but you might draw something. So a painting can be true, a representation of somebody can be true. And something is simply true if it conforms to reality. A simple definition, but not very useful because it's, again, kind of tautological. You have to agree to what reality is before you can really use it. A lot of modern definitions People like Dewey, but in the spirit of pronouncing it wrong, let's call him Dewey. Say that truth is your statements tested in practice, that the truth is confirmed if you say something, and then the things that you say come to fruition. So when your concepts are put into practice. If I say the Lakers are going to win this week, and they don't, then I was lying. But if we're trying to verify that the world works the way you say, like if I say, this apple is going to fall when I drop it, that's easy. But if I say something really complicated, like if we only cut the marginal tax rate by 2%, then the economy would grow by 14 points, that's going to be pretty hard for us to verify. And at the very least, that means that anything we say requires us to wait until later to figure it out if it's true or not. And then, of course, we need to agree when we're verifying it that we're verifying it the same way. So we needed a foundational truth just to verify whether you said worked the way you said it. There's a quote from Feynman that's good for this. We can only be sure we are wrong. So very hard to be sure you're right. Easy to be sure you're wrong. So some philosophers that follow this kind of school of thought think, well, you can't really prove something's true, but you can prove something's not, and that's almost good enough. Think about that a bit. Maybe you could just do that. Maybe that's good enough. Maybe you just have to not lie, and that's good enough to be telling the truth. Constructionists like Hegel and Marx thought the truth was socially and historically and culturally constructed. There was no objective truth. This is the best for software, right? Because now I don't even need a terms and conditions. Right? If nothing is objectively true, then I can just say I'm charging you $10 and charge you $35. And I was right, because your objective truth is just different than mine. For me, $35 is the same thing as 10. Now pay up. But really, postmodernists and their other philosophical predecessors say there's no such thing as truth, and that's essentially just skepticism on steroids. Skepticism dates all the way back to ancient Greece, and skeptics are, as we know, we even have that word in English, skeptic. Call people that. It means you're not sure what's true. And if you just take that all the way to its maximum level, you're not even sure what truth is in general. Okay, but if you say that there's no such thing as the truth, that's obviously a paradox, because that statement is a statement of fact. And if that statement is true, then at least one statement is true. So you've created a paradox. Pretty simple one. It's like this statement is false, the classic paradox. But Hegel and other philosophers who derive from him, where most of the postmodernists get their philosophical roots, would say that that's good, that's great. Because the highest philosophical truth actually is a paradox. You take a thing and an anti-thing, and you synthesize them together, and that's how you get a real awesome truth. Okay, well, it's easy to challenge epistemology itself like that. Can you really know anything for certain? And can you prove that you know anything for certain? Well, if somebody says that they know nothing at all, then no, you probably can't prove anything to them. Truth by consensus is not a particularly popular view, for some pretty obvious reasons. Truth is what some group agrees it is. So if America agrees something's true, then it's true for America. But it's kind of hard to argue that this isn't how it works in practice. And when the terms that you write are judged for whether or not they're true or not, truth by consensus is actually the only thing that matters. Because if you end up in a court, it's the consensus of 12 people about whether you lied or not. Or 8, depending on the size of your jury. I think civil juries are smaller. So truth by consensus is actually kind of baked into our legal definition of truth, at least. Now, software engineers, being the way that they are, like to believe that truth is programmable, because software engineers sure do love truth tables. So A is equal to D because A is equal to B, and D is not C, and C is not B and A, and you could go on like that forever. You can create these little truth predicates and solve for what's true and false. And understandably, this is not very popular with almost anybody that isn't mathematically minded, which is most people. Talk about Nietzsche a bit, in the spirit of pronouncing it wrong. Nietzsche, which is really the way his name is spelled. Although Nietzsche is one of the greatest thinkers of the 1800s, he's also quite a bit of a troll, and also quite a bit of an incel, as we'll see from his next statement. Not a lot of success with women in Nietzsche's life. So, let's read his maybe most famous statement on truth, which is not a topic he discusses very much, because his philosophy doesn't really consider it that important. But let's read this whole thing. A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, I don't even know what a metonym is, I'll be honest with you, and anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which, after long use, seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that that is what they are. Metaphors which are worn out and have lost their sensuous power. They are like coins which have lost their pictures, faces, and which now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. An interesting thing to think about. Some might boil down that argument to truth is relative or something almost postmodernist like that, but it's really not. It's actually kind of quite on the contrary. He's arguing that truth is firm and truth is canonical, but it's also illusory. It's an interesting statement in a lot of ways. I'll let you think more about it individually. Let's look at his other statement. What if the truth were a woman? Which is how he opens up one of his most famous essays. Again, bit of a sexist Nietzsche. But in his era, and even in ours, to an extent, if you look at the language around it, truth has this masculine connotation surrounding it. When you're arguing, you have a position. You attack other people's positions. You win arguments. It's all war terminology. It's all fighting stuff. Very masculine, very odd that it is that way, isn't it? Since we're just trying to figure out what's true or not. So, it might be better to translate Nietzsche's phrase as kind of a challenge to the philosophers of his era, saying, what if it's not any of that stuff at all? What if it's not really a fight? What if we don't have positions that we have to reinforce with facts, and that the strongest sort of case wins, that we're just basically fighting a game of war, and facts are kind of our manpower and so forth. What if it's not that at all? What if it's something different? Okay, so software, nothing we say is easy to label as true. Okay, at the end of the day, whatever we call data, that's electrical pulses in wires. The service is electrical pulses in wires. Then there's zeros and ones on top of that. We got hardware, we got electricity running through silicon, we got stuff running through wires and tons of different algorithms, stuff bouncing around over the internet. I mean, there's abstraction on top of abstraction on top of abstraction, and nobody understands all of it. So it's pretty fair to say that when you say something like, we don't share your data, you don't really know what that means. Let's say that there are only two computers in this scenario, A and B claims, I don't share A's data, but they're talking to each other. So A's data has to travel over the internet to get to B. Well, okay, maybe it's encrypted on the way. Well, all right. Well, can you guarantee that it doesn't get decrypted? Well, maybe. Well, can you guarantee that nobody else has access to it? Well, maybe, but we can't really audit B, so we're not really sure. And there's so many different levels to we don't share your data. What does that mean exactly? Does it mean nobody ever gets to see it? I mean, who even sees it at Organization B? Anybody? Somebody that works for them? Their subsidiaries? It's a difficult statement to make. And there's omissions everywhere too, because is it even possible to tell the whole truth in software? And if it was possible, would anybody even care? If you're talking about your service and how the client's machine talks to it over the internet, and all the details that play into that, and all of the information that you collect, and how you use every individual piece of information, and so forth. Remember from consent that burying the user in information is actually a way to lessen their ability to consent. If you just overwhelm them with knowledge and make it impossible for them to pick out what's important and what isn't, that's not going to make them more informed, that's going to make them less informed. It's actually kind of the difference between the Soviet and the Western model of propaganda. See, Soviets, they just lied or omitted information a lot. They just left out bad stuff, told you about good stuff, told you bad stuff about the enemy. When they were telling you about good stuff, they'd leave out all the bad stuff that was part of the good stuff. Sometimes they just straight up tell you stuff that kinda happened. If you just full on lied, people might find out, but you could definitely stretch everything a pretty long way. Whereas the Western propaganda model was just, not everybody have all the info they want, and we'll also just fire hose people with information. We'll just drown them in low quality information. And maybe there'll be some high quality stuff too, but there's just so much of it that even if people find out something bad, they'll just forget about it by the end of next week. Because there's all this other stuff going on. Who can really remember? And while it's hard to say that the Western approach didn't work better, and doesn't still work better, because in the Soviet one, people are pretty good at knowing that they're being lied to. Eventually, it gets found out one way or another. And it's very hard to suppress information on a large scale. But just burying people in info until they check out, that works great. Has its own drawbacks too, but it certainly works. So software, same thing. All right, so for today's discussion, we're asking, does software need to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And let's, for this discussion, ignore pricing and things like, did they agree to charge you for 1 month, but then charge you for 2? Let's say that nothing like financial related is part of the discussion. So we're talking about other terms, but not necessarily financial. And you could still argue something like a software claims to be free, but they're actually charging you money in some subtle way, or maybe they're selling your data. And you could argue that those are lies still. I just don't want to get too bogged down in like, the software said it was $5, but they charged you 10. I think almost everyone's going to agree that that's wrong. Or the software said they were going to charge you for 1 month, but they charged you for 10. Again, I think we're all probably going to agree to an extent that that's wrong. Although there are cases like Adobe where they charge you for 12 months, but only under these very particular terms if you don't cancel the free trial within a certain amount of time. Fair game to talk about that today. Just again, don't get too bogged down in like, they said they were going to charge me $5, but they charged me 10. Yeah, we know that that's probably wrong. All right, so if you're on the moral side, then you think, yeah, software has to tell the whole truth, the truth, nothing but the truth. You better explain what that means then, if you're on that side. If you're on the moral side, then no, you don't think they have to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You think they just have to tell you the big stuff. You have to define the big stuff, but let's say something like that it won't make your PC explode is one of those things, and I'll ask you to define what else qualifies as big stuff. And if you're on the amoral side, then as always you think that it depends. For some things, software needs to tell the whole truth. For others, it can omit some things, or even straight up lie. And again, I'm going to ask you, what does it depend on? So all right, I will see you in Discord shortly.